Initially, Australia really didn't do much about it. But then Canberra started becoming worried as to whether the Chinese might open a military base somewhere. Vanuatu was mentioned.
Welcome to Baker's Dozen, RANE's podcast series about geopolitics from Stratford. The idea of the Indo-Pacific as a single theater of competition has taken hold in Western strategic thought. Discussions often focus on the South China Sea, they focus on Taiwan, and increasingly on Australia's role with the new AUKUS and the expansion of the role of the Quad. In addition, there has been greater attention to, for example, the Indian Ocean and India's role in this idea of a greater Indo-Pacific area. But something that's often conspicuously absent is the rest of the Pacific. When we think about the Melanesian, the Micronesian, and the Polynesian islands, these areas stretched across the broad swath of the Western and South Pacific are really strategically important. And this was seen, of course, during World War II and the island hopping as the United States was able to push itself back up and constrain and ultimately defeat Japan. Today, these islands remain strategically important, even if the attention internationally is not on them in the same way that it was in the past. Today, I'm speaking to Colin Chapman, a geopolitical journalist and a fellow at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And we're going to look at some of these issues that are at play in the Pacific. Colin, thank you for joining me here today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Colin, both Australia, obviously, and with the latest defense paper, New Zealand, are reawakening to the importance of their roles, of the roles that they play in the broader Pacific, and of the strategic risks that are facing them, despite their traditionally or in recent history, their sort of isolated space and their ability to protect themselves from what else was going on in the world. Much of this has been driven by expanding Chinese activity in the Pacific Island nations as well. As we look at this region, how do you see Australia's views of its roles and responsibilities shifting, particularly amid expanding Chinese activity, not only in Southeast Asia, but certainly in the Pacific Islands?
Well, the really big shift, as you say, Roger, has been in Australia. And you remember that in the early part of the 21st century, a lot of policymakers and opinion formers were, they were following the thought that some academics were arguing in Australia that Australia had to make a choice. And that choice was between the ANZUS partner, the United States, long-standing defense partner, strategic partner, and then China, which was the main economic partner for Australia. And, looking at China's economic growth and buying power, the Chinese were beginning to win friends in Canberra. And in fact, in 2015, Xi Jinping, the president of China, they rolled out the red carpet for him and invited him to address a joint session of Parliament in Canberra. And both he and Prime Minister Morrison were talking about peace in the Pacific and great friendships and the rest of it. And what was happening in the real world of Australia was that Chinese money was buying up property throughout the country. Chinese were buying places for their kids in universities in Australia and in expensive private schools. And then, surprisingly, a Chinese state-owned company was allowed to take a long-term lease on the strategic port of Darwin, which is the closest part of Australia to the South China Sea. And many people in the White House were completely amazed at that, but it happened. And then things got worse because China launched the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and asked Australia to be a partner. And in fact, it became the sixth largest shareholder, with Canberra putting up more than $1 billion in equity for this. Go on from that, and then we had the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative right across Asia, with the new infrastructure being built between Beijing and Turkey and then on to Europe and links down to a port on the Indian Ocean in Pakistan. And the whole of Asia, except for Japan and Taiwan, bought into this. So everyone was pro China, and then of course things changed, as we know, and the war of words between China and Canberra took off, and we reverted very, very rapidly to the situation that had existed when John Howard had been Prime Minister, when he was referred to as the first deputy sheriff of the United States in the Pacific. And that's where we are now, and the Pacific has totally changed. The Pacific is different.
Right. Yeah, I remember the Howard Doctrine and the real strategic focus that was going on at that time, and the anticipation early on that this was going to be the change in the direction of Australia, and it was reasserting itself. And then, of course, with the United States pulled over into South and West Asia post 9/11, a lot of everything else just sort of snuck to the side. And clearly Australia, as you've noted, kind of moved into that area of, I guess, accepting the Chinese economic benefits while downplaying any of the strategic risks or challenges. And New Zealand as well, obviously, was doing the same thing. And I think the bit of a surprise coming out of New Zealand recently has been, of course, this latest defense paper that seems to really raise up China again as saying China is, it doesn't say specifically, but it sort of hints China is a strategic threat, and New Zealand can no longer feel that it can be out of everything, that it's out of the way. And so there does seem to be this sense of pressure pushing down on both New Zealand and Australia, where in the past they thought they could sort of ignore their way out of what was happening in the rest of Asia on the strategic front.
Well, that's right. And of course, the China issue is the big issue in the Pacific, because initially Australia really didn't do much about it, didn't worry about it, just thought it was something that went on. Okay, the Chinese are opening a few Chinese stores and selling stuff off cheap. But then it grew and grew and grew. And then Canberra started becoming worried as to whether whether the Chinese might open a military base somewhere. Vanuatu was mentioned as a possibility. And the key thing in that defense paper you mentioned from Wellington was also that very, very fear. The New Zealanders mentioned that they'd noticed that alongside Chinese communities developing in many Pacific islands, growing up alongside them had been paramilitaries which were supporting China. So that's where the alarm bells started ringing.
Right. So as we look at this, if we think about it from a geographic perspective, all right, New Zealand and Australia sit behind sort of a protective shield. Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Melanesian states, so Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, of course, that you're talking about, New Caledonia, which had recently, in a bit of a contested vote, decided to stay French. But that shield has been there. Canberra has had very mixed relations with these countries over the year, though, at times intervening during political crises, at times perhaps in political competition or in political crises with these countries. How do we see Australia balancing its need for more proactive relations in the region with the risk of perhaps being seen either as a U.S. deputy or as another imperial power pushing itself on these smaller states, particularly the Melanesian states, but also, for example, what's going on in Australian-Indonesian relations, because Indonesia obviously is a pretty powerful force in and of itself, particularly in the ASEAN region.
Well, it doesn't want to be an imperial power. I mean, though, of course, not a few people in Australia, particularly left-wing academics, continue to paint that picture. That's exactly what they say is going on. But what really has happened is that Morrison has developed very much as a nationalist. He picked up that trait when he was great pals with Donald Trump, you may remember. And he comes back and now he talks continually about putting Australia first. Where did we first hear that? In your country, I think. But actually, he is not in that mode when it comes to the Pacific. In fact, he likes to call the Pacific a family, he likes to think of Australia as part of the Pacific family, which is a bit paternalistic, of course. And on his way to and from Europe for, first of all, G20 and then COP26 lately, he made a point of entering discussions with a lot of Pacific leaders. He supports the Pacific leaders in their demand for more money, which basically didn't quite get through COP26 because the Pacific, he says, the leaders there need more money to be able to adapt to the technology that they're going to need to support climate change. But he is supporting them. For example, Australia has provided $1 billion Australian dollars, that's about 360 American dollars by my calculation, to fight rising sea temperatures in the Pacific. And there's also a lot of other things going on. He has started a emissions trading scheme with Fiji. It's the first emissions trading scheme that Fiji has signed up to. And there's also lots of money going from the Australia-Indonesia Institute to people operations in the world's fourth largest economy. And none of this could really be called imperial. Now, the Solomons thing is very interesting because you will know that Australia intervened very recently in the Solomon Islands following a call from the Prime Minister to Canberra for help with ethnic rivalries getting out of control in Honiaru, where some government buildings are actually burnt down. They include a big government office, a bank, and a high school. And Morrison responded immediately to this. Within 24 hours, a posse of Australian federal police were in a plane on the way to the Solomon Islands to restore law and order. And very shortly after that, another 50 were in another plane to guard key infrastructure. But this is a very interesting development because this is based on an agreement in 2017 between Australia and the Solomons, whereby Australia would intervene in such a way. And it's a unique agreement. There's no other agreement between any other country in the Pacific. And there's a very strict rule attached to it, and that is that Australia will not interfere in any way in the politics that might be involved in any of these clashes. And of course, there's deep politics involved in all of these clashes.
Right,
but it's very a neat way in which Australia can act as the first deputy sheriff without actually sounding or being imperial.
Well, and in this case, it becomes really interesting in the Solomon Islands because, of course, the ethnic conflict is between those in Guadalcanal and those in Malaysia. And, of course, the Solomon Islands have recently switched, in the last few years, switched recognition from Taiwan to mainland China. And it's those on Guadalcanal who supported that shift in recognition. those on Malaysia are the ones who supported the continued relationship with Taiwan, and that's part of the stress that we see. So interestingly, the Australians, to maintain a level of stability and fulfill their role, intervened on behalf of, if we want to way oversimplify it, intervened on behalf of the pro-Chinese forces, despite the fact that we see in the broader strategic context the Australians are now pushing back against China. And this is a dynamic that seems to be at play. China has been able to exploit or manipulate the internal stresses within these different Pacific Island nations where they have ethnic competition. We've seen it as far up into, we've seen it actually in Okinawa. The Chinese have tried to play games in U.S. territories in the Pacific as well by exploiting these internal aspects. So it's interesting as we look at the strategic context here. To maintain stability, Australia intervenes, but it does so sort of in a way that angered the forces that the U.S. is actually helping financially, and the Australians would like to help, who want to push back against Chinese encroachment.
Right, exactly what's happening, and that is happening right throughout the whole of the Pacific, and then of course you have the relationship with Jakarta, which is become very interesting because Australia is very, very keen on closer economic relations with Jakarta and with Indonesia generally. It wants a free trade agreement. The ABAR, which is the Bureau of Agricultural Economics in Canberra, has just completed a study of food requirements in Indonesia over the next 50 years and finds out, or says, that in 50 years' time, Indonesia will need 400% more food than it's got at the moment. And obviously Australia would like to fill the void there because Australia's got plenty of cattle, plenty of beef, plenty of dairy, plenty of everything really. It could supply all of Indonesia's short-term needs in the long term, although the prices might be a bit too expensive for Jakarta. But Jakarta is pushing back on that a bit because it's always wanted to be self-sufficient, not too dependent on anyone. And then there's a bigger issue with Indonesia, and that is that President Widodo is very, very annoyed about the whole
the
whole AUKUS deal, the submarine deal, and particularly about the Quad, which he says, is really anathema to the region. So much so that Indonesia in October asked for a strategic review of the non-proliferation treaty as to whether Australia might be in breach of it because it's not a nuclear power, having nuclear powered submarines. Now, I think that might be splitting hairs, but nonetheless, this review is taking place. And more to the point, the Australian Broadcasting Commission has reported that President Widodo, at the most recent ASEAN summit, really laid into Morrison time and time again in a very strident and strong manner about AUKUS. I said it's wrong, and he believes that countries like Australia should be like ASEAN itself, sort of fairly neutral. And of course, in comes France, free of any obligations to Australia now, and having got New Caledonia still within its remit, so to speak, with President Macron saying that he wants France to be a neutral in the Pacific too, and really supporting the Indonesian view. And obviously France has got a lot of surplus food that he would like to sell to Jakarta.
Right, yes. I mean, as we look at Indonesia, obviously this ASEAN concept, trying to stay neutral in the face of rising US-China competition. The Quad moves right through Indonesian waters. AUKUS and the Australians are going to move right through past Indonesia. So this puts them in the center, and their perception is it may try to force them to choose sides, and they obviously don't want to do that. And I think there's also this lingering stress between Australia and Indonesia. If we go back 20 years, it was the Timor independence movement, right? And of course, Australia effectively intervened on the side of Timor. Then there were all sorts of issues over gas and splitting gas fields, but that certainly held, was a bit of a stress in that relationship there. So it does seem that, as Australia looks to re-engage in the region, there are a lot of historical components and structural components that are going to challenge their ability to do this in a relatively easy way, or a way that everybody welcomes them with open arms.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
So if we step back for a moment and move back over into the Pacific, right? When we think about World War II, and the Pacific Islands, you go back even further, the Pacific Islands were important because they were coaling stations for trans-Pacific trade. And then, and I'm not, we're being kind of crude here and saying important. We're talking about important in this global sense. Obviously, every place is important to the people who live there. But in that strategic sense, they were important as coaling stations. Then in World War II, it was the distance of operational aircraft, right? So the island hopping campaign was about grabbing airfields so that you could continue to push air power. Obviously now, maritime power, air power, space, these are much more distant than and the range is much greater than it used to be. So how do we think about the strategic significance of Pacific Islands these days, whether it's in things like the maritime territory that they control under UNCLOS, the size of their EEZs, or even competition over, say, communications and transportation. And lately, we've been seeing a lot of competition over submarine cables even. But what are some of the strategic importance of these islands to the bigger powers and to the region?
Well, these are very important questions, Roger. And for me, the 3 points stand out. And that is sea lanes, trade and resources, and international rivalry. Those 3 points run across everything. And if you look at the geography, the two straits that are on the western end of the Pacific, the straits of Malacca and Lombok, they're sentinels to the western Pacific. And through the Malacca Straits, 40% of world trade passes, by my latest calculation, which is huge when you think of it. That's all that trade going to China, from China going to Japan. Also, you've got something like 15 million barrels a day of oil going through the Malacca Strait. And then there's the Lombok Strait, which is the strait that's between Indonesia and Australia itself, which is also very important, and there's a very big choke point. And there are suggestions that Australia is very keen for the United States to have a naval base in northwestern Australia at Exmouth. And of course, the purpose of that would be if the Chinese became even more aggressive than they have been already in the South China Sea, and the United States felt the need to block the access to those important sea lanes for China, then running the Navy out of Exmouth would be a very good thing. So that's their key strategic places, without a doubt. And then secondly, another key point is that the South Pacific is the main sea lane really to Antarctica. And Antarctica is almost a separate subject, I think, because there's so many issues involved with it. But the Chinese and the Americans are at odds with the trustees of Antarctica, which include Australia, who's the most significant trustee, having access to the greatest amount of land in this subpolar region, and and there's only really one main route into that, and that's through the Pacific.
Right. And then I would add, as I'm looking at these places, uh, listening posts, satellite tracking facilities. This is something that China has been doing in the Pacific Islands, as well as the key routes when you think about connecting the United States to Australia, right? I mean, you move through these South Pacific Islands states. And then finally, as you had mentioned earlier, resources, right? I think if we look at these states, the potential maritime protein resources, which we already see countries, using up resources in places like the South China Sea. We see expanding Chinese fishing fleets off the coast of the Americas, trying to reach. With climate change, there's shift in the location of fish stock. So traditional fishing grounds are now moving. So people are looking for that. Down the road, there's the question of subsea mineral resources. Even if we're not talking about oil and natural gas, hydrocarbons, to be able to do an energy transition, there are other minerals that you're going to need. And there's been a lot of exploration of the potential for feasible exploitation of mineral resources on the seabed. So those become important. And then finally, I think, again, the idea of telecommunications cables. And we've seen the Australians recently put up money to make sure that an Australian company buys a big telecommunications company that manages cables through the South Pacific, as well as the Australians, the Americans, I think the Japanese getting together to fund cables going in that traditionally would have been funded by the Chinese, because there's a concern of control over the flow of information and access to information. Yeah. So even if these aren't the routes for aircraft, they're certainly the routes for information now.
Yeah, well, part of that, of course, is to keep Hawaii out of the South Pacific Islands as far as possible, which they haven't totally succeeded with, but that was one of the goals, and that was something where clearly the Australians were working with the Americans. But you're quite right about the Antarctic and the demand for minerals, which is at its early stages, but the fishing issue is very, very important, because the Chinese are building huge ships for use down there, and then the Chinese also, along with the Russians, have the largest number of icebreakers in the waters that give access to Antarctica, where, of course, the ice cap is melting faster than it's ever done. So this is something which is brewing and will become much more important. And the real issue there too is whether trustees of the Antarctic Treaty, which include Australia, have been rather negligent in the way they look after the trust that's placed in them. For example, both China and the United States have bases in Australian Antarctic territory. Now, they're not allowed to be military bases, but they're supposed to be checked regularly, and the number of checks that have taken place at either of these bases seems absolutely minimal, and in case of the Chinese, I don't think it's happened at all.
Right. It's really I think this is one of the important points that comes out, and we'll have to come back and talk about Antarctica at another time. But how the idea of the Pacific Islands, which we think of as sandy and palm tree and warm, and then Antarctica, which is cold and ice covered, are intimately linked because of key maritime routes, because of this broader element of strategic competition, because of competition over resources, and that's kind of a different way of looking at things. We can't look at these different regions in isolation from one another. As we look forward, then, with Australia now expanding through the AUKUS, taking a greater role in Quad, like we talked about New Zealand's defense paper, reawakening to the concerns that they have. France stepping back into the Pacific. We've seen the Germans flirting with reaching into the Pacific. Obviously, the U.S. is there. What are the ways that we can expect some of these local medium and big powers like Australia, like New Zealand, to adjust their behavior or their actions in this Pacific region over the next few years? And are there still challenges that they're going to be facing as they try to re-engage and expand their operations?
Well, I think there are. I think one of the big points really is that a lot of people in Australia, in particular, are putting forward the idea that the Pacific Islands Forum, which is a forum, but it's fairly bureaucratic and very slow to act, by the way, and it is the reason why that deal with the Solomon Islands that Australia struck is in place, because the Pacific Islands used to be the place where these kind of things were resolved, and they were so slow in actually taking action that the Solomon Islands decided that they better go directly to Australia and see if they could find a way of sorting it out. That's just by the by. But to come back to your point, both Australia and New Zealand want to be more proactive in the Pacific. There's no doubt about it. They still talk about moving more to the Pacific, but the trouble is they're not quite sure how to do it. Some Australian academics particularly, but others are arguing that the Pacific Islands Forum should be converted to a Pacific Islands community, and they've put forward a model based on the European model, whereby there would be a council of ministers, of chief ministers, and also ministers for each sector like energy and fisheries and all the rest of it. And then after that would be a Pacific Islands Council, rather like the European Parliament. Well, it's just hard to see that working in that region. It's just not going to happen. And other people think that what needs to happen is for a better dialogue to take place between the politicians of Australia and New Zealand and Germany and France and the Pacific Islanders, with more listening going on. And there's a recent book which you might want to dip into, which has just been published by the deputy leader of the Australian Labor Party, who's also the deputy leader of the opposition. It's called Tides That Bind Australia to the Pacific, and it's by Richard Marles. And he comes up with one key quote in it. If we are in the Pacific because we don't want China to be there, then we will get it all wrong, he says. And I think those are very wise words.
Yeah, there needs to be a strategic intent rather than just a counter something else.
Exactly.
And I think that's the challenge. That's the challenge we've seen. I mean, if we were to take this wider, that's the challenge we've seen with the U.S. and the European response to Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. Rather than having a proactive policy, it seems to be a responsive policy. Well, we don't want them, and this is where China has the cash resources and the willingness to do things. And until these other countries find goals rather than just counter goals, it's very difficult for them to make the case, and they're going to run into these challenges.
You could take the same analogy to the current issue between Russia and the United States over Ukraine. President Putin is playing a clever hand because he's saying, well, okay, so you agree that NATO will not extend ever into Ukraine, and I will withdraw my troops and everything will be happy forever and now. And the Americans can't agree to that. On the other hand, it's the obvious solution to the problem.
Right. So I know we could take this and go on forever, and it's great talking with you again, Colin. And I love that we have taken our discussion of the Pacific and moved it all the way to Ukraine and the Antarctic and up to Japan and all over the place. And I think that reinforces just how important this region is and central it is, but also how interconnected things are. And so I really want to thank you, Colin, for being here with me today. Colin Chapman is a fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. The Pacific Island strategic position remains geopolitically important, especially amid intensifying US-China competition. Stay ahead of developments in the region. Subscribe to Worldview today. Go to stratfor.com for a special offer through December 2021. That's stratfor.com. I'm Roger Baker, and thank you for listening.